I didn't decide to become an architect until probably the year before I started graduate school. Architecture was never really primary in my mind for education. I can remember as a teenager, young teenager, thinking about architecture as a possibility. But I met a fellow once who was an architect who was very discouraging about the financial rewards of architecture and how disappointed he was in his early career as an architect. So he changed. And I let that influence me for quite a few years. But from the time I was a young person, I loved woodworking. I took woodworking almost every year I was in secondary school, beginning in 7th grade. Loved to create, loved to draft, loved the creative process. And after I had bumped around in a lot of different things at the University of Utah, I finally came back to the realization that I wanted to do something that was enjoyable. And that sounded enjoyable. Admittedly, I don't think many of us really understand what architecture is all about until we're actually there practicing. But it sounded wonderful. And fortunately for me, that's the way it did turn out. When I was an undergraduate at the university, I had a real interest in a lot of different things. I was reasonably good at math. I thought about engineering. I enjoyed geology immensely. And so with a combination of taking geology and quite a bit of math, I was offered a scholarship by the geophysics department. J.P. Getty Oil Company was the sponsor of my scholarship. And I held that scholarship for a number of years, so it paid for a good portion of my undergraduate education. But I found that the prospects for what I would be doing after I graduated in geophysics were not things that were tremendously appealing to me. So at a relative last minute, I went back to architecture and thought, you know, that sounds a lot more appealing than being in a lab somewhere in Louisiana or on an offshore drilling rig or in the field in Wyoming. I changed in my last year to urban geography, city planning, and applied to graduate school. And immediately went into Tom Cass's basic design. Graduate school was very demanding. And unfortunately, our economic condition was sufficient that I had to work all the time. And so as I finished graduate school in architecture, my nickname was the Ghost because I was never there. I was either working or I was working at home, trying to spend time with my wife. When I graduated, I continued to work for a fellow named Gordon Geege. And Gordon was a wonderful mentor. I worked for him for 3 years in school. And after I graduated, I kind of expected that I would work with Gordon, at least for a period of time more. His practice was quite limited, and it was just the two of us and the secretary, so I got to do pretty much everything. But out of the blue one day, I got a call from Woodbury Corporation saying, we're looking for an architect to be our full-time architect on staff. Would you mind coming and interviewing? And so I did. I got a call from a guy named Roy Silver. Woodbury had given me his name as a reference for them because he'd worked for them. So I returned Roy's call, interviewed with him, and he convinced me I didn't want to be in the development world, that I needed to come to work for him. And so I did. So about a year out of school, I started to work for Roy Silver and Dale Allsop. It was Silver Allsop Architects at that time. And my first experience really with a little bit larger firm, there were maybe 8 of us, including the 2 partners. And again, I got an opportunity to do a lot of different things. And so I was there for, well, during a period of time I was taking licensing exams. and passed the licensing exam, became licensed, and again found the work a little bit limiting and wanted to see it branch out a little bit. But it worked very well. And Roy had a philosophy of business that I really started to embrace. It was pay people what they need on a continuing basis to survive, and then at the end of the year give them a bonus that's beyond their expectations. And that became kind of a tenet of my practice throughout my career. And we were that way for quite a long period of time until about 1985, 86, at which point Roy was talking about retiring. And so a couple of years before that, he had actually bought out Dale Allsop. And so it was just Roy and I basically operating the firm with a good many really wonderful people with us. Grew to be about 10. And when Roy decided he was going to retire, I just continued on after he had retired, and soon realized that, again, I wanted a little bit more opportunity. And I was working for a fellow named Ross Wentworth. Most of my practice was public education, and we were working for Granite School District, and I watched Ross as he operated with his school district responsibilities, and not only did was I impressed with his abilities to administer, I was impressed with what he seemed to have as a good handle on design. And so after a period of time, I went to Ross and just said, how about leaving the ranks of the securely employed and joining those of us that are rather insecurely employed? But for those that haven't been in that environment, it's a scary decision. But he did make the decision to come and join me. And I had told him that if things worked out well, we would be partners, and we were very shortly thereafter. When I started for Silver Allsop, they had one educational client. They worked for Nebo School District. And the superintendent was a very, very bright man named Joe Reedhead. And Joe had convinced us that people were designing schools in the wrong way, that we were designing for ourselves and not for the needs of the school district. So we started to look at schools in a different way. And that was very influential in my career. Our portfolio expanded naturally and rather slowly as we would perform work that was very successful. Clients more or less started to come to us. At some point in time around the early 90s, I was doing work for the Washington School District and had done my first project for them, and it was extremely successful. Surprisingly, we got the work after we weren't even shortlisted. I was building a school in central Utah where they had a very limited budget and needed the school to be done within 9 months. And we told them the only way I can do that is something a little bit unusual, and we had suggested tilt-up concrete. And I had never detailed tilt-up concrete before, so I called a fellow named Mike Upwall, who was doing a lot of service stations, garages, warehouses, and uniquely, Mike Upwall was an expert in tilt-up construction. And when I went to him and asked him to come in and help us learn how to do this, his comment was, I've never had an architect ask me for advice or even value what I had to say. So I'm going to come in and spend time with you for free. I'm so impressed by your willingness to listen. And so he came in a number of times and would sketch out things and would tell us how to detail tilt-up concrete. And so after that, when Washington School District needed to do a new school and they wanted it to be very economical, they called Mike Upwall as a consultant during their selection process. They didn't select me or my firm. And Mike, when he joined that group, said, "Are you nuts? You've got somebody out there who has the technique and the understanding. Why don't you hire him?" And they went through the process, selected somebody else, and then came to me and said, what would be your ideas? Come down and talk to us. And so we went down and talked about some of the things we'd been doing, some of the possibilities, and it resonated with them. And so on a Saturday early one morning, I'm cutting my lawn and I get a phone call from Superintendent Stephen Peterson, Washington School District. And he said, can you be down here Monday morning with a contract? We'd like to get something going immediately. And we had, as I remember, 60 days to get this school designed, detailed, and underway. And again, Mike helped us. That was kind of the beginning of what I felt to be a very successful endeavor at promoting public education. We did a number of wonderful schools in Washington School District that were not only pleasing, but in their estimation, much more economical than anything they had ever done before. So we started using that and bringing people down and showing them our work, and that expanded to eventually about 80% of the school districts in the state of Utah, plus around Wyoming, Idaho. The number one project in my mind that we have worked on was a collaboration with Thomas Pfeiffer and Partners out of New York City, and that is the federal courthouse. And we had done some projects within the historic Frank Moss Federal Courthouse that were really enjoyable and allowed us to get into a lot of detail, specifically historical woodworking, moldings, wonderful stuff. And after doing that, we entered the competition for the new Frank Moss Courthouse, and we had approached another firm that we'd been working with that we knew through our association with GSA out of Denver. At that time we were doing quite a bit of federal government work. And they had already accepted somebody they felt like they needed to partner with. And so we didn't think too much about it until one day I got a phone call from a fellow named Thomas Pfeiffer. And I didn't know Thomas, but after the phone call I was pleasant with him and just said, well, thanks, but we've kind of decided maybe not to pursue it. And I talked with Chris Lund, who we had added to the firm by then, and Chris looked at me and said, Thomas Pfeiffer? And he whipped open Architectural Record, and there in Architects in the News was this little picture of Thomas Pfeiffer, and very talented architect. And he had been one of the lead designer in Meyer's office in New York. And so I didn't know how to call him back, but he called back a couple of days later and said, I don't think we finished that conversation. And we had a very good conversation and decided, yes, we would pursue the competition. We had been working enough on the old historic court building to understand what we thought they really wanted. And so we did it. And it was a successful experience. We not only had fun with the competition and the designs that were prepared, but Thomas was extremely easy to work with. And I have always expected that someone with the notoriety and the talent of a Thomas Pfeiffer would be difficult to work with, and it was absolutely quite the opposite. Thomas was pleasant, friendly, and he loved being in our office. What we learned from that experience is a greater appreciation and understanding of how collaborative design process needed to be. I think people tend to think that the architect of a building is one singular person, and in my experience, never is, hardly ever is. It's always the talents and desires, expectations of many others that are contributing to that design process that make it very successful. Thomas came into our office and talked about some of the beautiful projects he had done around the world, and helped us to understand that we need to be looking further and reaching further in our designs, but also recognizing that many people within the process contribute. And that was a good thing for us all to learn. Thomas used to come into our firm and we'd have lunch meetings that would take a couple of hours. We'd bring in lunch and everybody would come into the lunchroom. At that time we were probably 25 people, and we'd fill it. And it was fun to listen. And after he had finished with his first discussion, my comment was, it's really fun to elevate yourself above the horizon just long enough to see what's really out there and what other architects at an international level are doing and what they're thinking and how they're doing it. Probably the disappointment that was the worst for me to accommodate in practicing happened relatively late in my career. I retired in 2011, November of 2011. And what became most disturbing to me was the willingness of architects to negotiate and compete on work based on fee. One was the fee that other architects were willing to offer, and second was the willingness of some architects to agree to things in interviews that were impossible to achieve. Specifically, an owner would suggest a budget, say that's our limit of budget. Well, we can certainly meet that. And then to find out that the project later on was considerably above what that architect had agreed to. But those two things, being willing to say anything in an interview even though you know you could not deliver, and agreeing to a fee which also you should have known wasn't going to work for you and your firm, and so then you started going about a change order process as a contractor would do. And that was something we were unwilling to do. If we negotiated a fee, it was the fee. Unless the owner added considerable scope, which rarely happens. So we used those as two defining characteristics of the way that our firm operated. The change in architecture from the time I came out of school to the time I retired was unbelievable. I started drafting with rapidograph pens, ink pens, technical pens on mylar, or originally on linen, and nobody remembers linen, on mylar, and hand drafting, and working tediously over details and by hand, learning how to letter and taking pride in the way that you could letter. And that went on for a few years until the first IBM PC AT came out. And I guess that probably the Wang came out originally. And the Wang was, I went to a seminar where we looked at the Wang, and Niels Valentiner was doing the presentation. And we looked at his presentation and thought, now that has some interest, but we just can't see it applying right now to what we're doing. And so we didn't make a move then. It was probably about a year later that IBM came out with their first PCAT. And we did purchase a new computer. And we purchased a plotter that we affectionately called the boat anchor. And the plotter was a 4-pen plotter, again, 4 rapidographs that you needed to watch and you needed to fill. And the only thing that was practical with that machine was to run it all night. We'd draft all day, and then someone would have to stay all night and watch this plotter work, because if a pen ran out of ink in the middle of a plot, it was garbage. You could never recalibrate to the exact point that your pen ran out of ink. So we finally migrated through several iterations to when we finally arrived at AutoCAD. And we had a difficult decision making that decision between VersaCAD and AutoCAD, which were the two available at the time. We made the right choice, I believe, in AutoCAD. And from then on, we always had AutoCAD in the office. And a little bit at a time, we would move people from hand drafting to computer drafting. But very, very difficult learning curve for those of us that had learned hand drafting. And for those that we found, some people just simply didn't take to the computer. And it was a hard process for them. We had one fellow in the office that was there when I began, that we said, if we ever put him on a computer, we're going to come up and find out he'd be putting whiteout on his computer screen or trying to erase off of his computer screen. But he ended up being a wonderful computer draftsman. The advantages of CAD, computer-aided design, enormous, just enormous. And looking back on that, we may have been better off to have accepted that technology earlier. And there were a lot of pains in accepting it when we did, but I think some did a little bit better job than we did at jumping into that technology. But when you get to the evolution of Revit, and when you can model building in 3-dimension, and you can look at conflicts of structure, mechanical, electrical systems, when you can define dimensioning on the computer to where there are no dimensional errors, was a huge leap. The disadvantages would be cost and the continual upgrade. The longest we could ever make it with a computer was 2.5 to 3 years. I think the longest we ever made it with a plotter was about 2 years, because they would be continually advancing all of the time. And our computer network, our backup capabilities, some of the systems that we had to use, I never would have imagined, and became a major cost center for us. But we also found that we drafted more efficiently. We produced documents more efficiently. You can't even really call it drafting anymore. But the disadvantage was cost and continual upgrade, and the advantage was, I think we did better work, and we could visualize it better, and we could show clients much better. I would tell them a couple of things. One is, you're headed into a difficult process, and so you have to be convinced that this is really the direction you want to go. Because the most discouraging thing would be for you to get partway through the process and decide you don't want to do it. And there are many that do that. The other thing is, if you're married, and this is drawing on personal experience, you better make sure that your companion, whether it's your husband or wife, depending on the situation, is fully committed to this process as well, because they know they're going to sacrifice a great deal. You're not going to have a lot of time when you start into graduate school. Would I change anything in my career? I don't think so. I was tremendously blessed with wonderful people, with very talented, dedicated, hardworking people. I am probably most proud of our staff, all of the people that we were able to employ, work with, and get to know during the years that I practiced, the most rewarding thing. So I wouldn't change any of that. I would certainly change how we educate architects. I think our educational process focuses exclusively on design and does not appropriately prepare architects for the rigors of practice. There are many wonderful designers who cannot succeed at architecture because they had absolutely no business acumen at all. They don't understand the nuances of running a business because we simply don't prepare, or haven't, to my knowledge, ever really focused on any of that. I started by doing the books in my father's service station at about 12 years old. And I understood, if the business doesn't succeed, then there is no business. And I would commonly tell some of our more talented designers, you can't spend indefinite time designing. You have to recognize that this is a business, and that's difficult for some to understand. But that's what they're prepared for. They're prepared to design, and that's all they want to do. But I also would focus on changing architectural licensing law. And during the time that I did spend in NCARB, we fought very hard to try to make the licensing process more acceptable, more meaningful, and not necessarily easier to achieve, but less timely to achieve. One of my passions when I began my career in NCRB, which happened, I was AIA Utah president in about 2008, 2009. And I was already on the board of directors of NCARB at that point, and watched what was going on, and developed a very strong friendship with a guy named Andy Prescott, Einhorn, Yaffe, and Prescott. One of the best mentors I've ever had, passionate about doing what he could to make this more accessible and more meaningful, the licensing process. And Andy turned out to be a good partner in trying to fight that battle. And the time between school, apprenticeship, and then taking the exam had to be examined carefully, had to be reworked. And so we fought hard in my tenure to allow examination while in school. Architecture is a wonderful profession. My last thought would be that it is a great way to spend your life. I would never have done it any other way. It is exactly what I think I was meant to do, and I wouldn't change any of it.